If you've been divorced once, you carry it differently the second time around. You're supposed to be wiser. You're supposed to have learned something from the wreckage of the first one, from the arguments about money, and the silences at dinner, and the final conversation where two people sit across from each other and say the thing they've both known for 2 years, but have been too afraid to say aloud. I had all of that with my first wife, Patricia. 26 years, 2 children, and an ending that felt like the implosion of an entire world. I told myself, when I arrived in Bangkok in March 2021, as a newly retired 62-year-old, with £450,000 in my account, and nothing left in England that felt like home, that I had paid the tuition on that lesson, that I wasn't going to make the same mistake twice, that wisdom was the one thing pain could purchase that was actually worth having. I was wrong about that. I was wrong in a way that cost me everything I had left to lose, and I want to tell you exactly how it happened, because I am 64 years old, and I have been sitting in a rented room in Peterborough for 7 months trying to work out what I'm going to do with the rest of my life, and the only thing I've found that feels useful is making sure someone else doesn't make it worse by repeating my particular version of this mistake. My name is Stephen. I spent 31 years as a secondary school headmaster in Cambridgeshire, the last 12 at a comprehensive in Ely that I was genuinely proud of. I was good at the job. I understood young people, I understood institutions, and I understood how systems work and why they fail when the people inside them stop being honest with each other. I understood all of that about schools and organizations, and I understood almost none of it about myself when it came to a 27-year-old English teacher named Juan from Bangkok's Sukhumvit area who had plans I never quite saw coming until the lawyer called. The divorce from Patricia finalized in November 2020. We had been functionally separated for 3 years before that, so the legal end of it didn't feel as catastrophic as it might have. What felt catastrophic was the quiet. I'm not a man who has ever been comfortable with silence. I spent 3 decades in buildings full of noise and purpose, and the specific energy of people who need things from you. And retirement arrived and the noise stopped all at once, and I didn't have anything behind it. My son James was in Edinburgh with his family. My daughter Ruth was in New Zealand. My friends from work were still embedded in the rhythm of the school year, and while they were kind about including me, the kindness had the quality of obligation rather than genuine shared purpose. I was, for the first time in my adult life, genuinely adrift. Bangkok was the suggestion of a former colleague, a history teacher named Ian, who had retired 3 years before me, and had been living in Thailand since 2018. He called me in January 2021, about 2 months after the divorce finalized, and said with the frankness of someone who knows you well enough to skip the preamble that I sounded terrible on the phone, and that he had a spare room, and that I should come for 6 weeks and see what I made of the place. I said I'd think about it. I booked a flight 2 days later. Pride has limited use when you're that lonely. Ian was living in an apartment near On Nut, a BTS, Bangkok SkyTrain station, southeast of the city center, that sits at the less expensive end of the Sukhumvit line, and has the lived-in quality of a neighborhood where actual people live rather than tourists pass through. He was easy company, Ian. He always had been. It was one of the things that made him a good colleague. And he showed me the city the way he'd shown students around historical sites, with enthusiasm and context and the specific pleasure of someone sharing something they genuinely love. He took me to a morning market on the second day, a local affair on a Sowa, side street, off the main road where the food was very good and very cheap, and the whole operation had the unpretentious energy of a place that existed for the neighborhood rather than for visitors. I ate cow tom, rice soup, for breakfast, and watched the city wake up, and felt, for the first time in several years, that I was somewhere rather than nowhere. I found Bangkok overwhelming for the first week, and then interesting for the second, and by the third week, I was extending my ticket. What I was responding to, I understand now better than I did then, was the combination of sensory richness and anonymity. The city asked nothing of me and offered everything in terms of stimulation, and that combination is extraordinarily soothing for someone who has spent 30 years being required by his role to be a specific, responsible, visible kind of person. In Bangkok, I was nobody in particular, which felt like relief rather than absence. By the time I flew home to sort out my affairs and pack properly, I had already decided that home was no longer the right word for England. I settled in my own apartment near Thong Lo in May 2021, having taken Ian's advice on the area and located a rental through an agent he recommended. Thong Lo has the quality of a slightly more residential version of the tourist-facing Sukhumvit strip, still urban and busy, but with more of the daily life of actual Bangkok residents mixed in. The kind of street where you walk past a 7-Eleven and a wet market and a small school in the same block. I settled into a routine that suited me. Morning walks, good cheap lunches, afternoons with books and the memoir I kept almost starting. I joined an expat social group that Ian was part of and attended a few events and found the typical range of people that such groups attract. Some genuinely interesting, some performatively interesting, some simply lonely in ways they'd learned to disguise as enthusiasm. I was in that third category, and I knew it, and I was working on not being in it when I met Juan in September. I met Juan in September 2021, 6 months after I moved to Thailand permanently. I was settled by then in my own apartment near Thong Lo, a more comfortable step up the Sukhumvit line from Ian's place, and I had fallen into the shape of a routine that suited me. Morning walks through Benjasiri Park, lunch near the market on Soi 38, afternoons reading or writing the memoir I kept telling myself I was going to start. I met her at a language exchange event near Ekamai, a casual gathering organized through an expat Facebook group where Thai people who wanted to improve their English met foreigners who were theoretically learning Thai, though in practice most of the foreigners just talked to each other and the Thai people talked to whoever would engage them. Juan approached me deliberately. I've thought about this a great deal since, and I'm convinced now that the approach was deliberate, though at the time it felt like the happy coincidence of a conversational event. She was 25 at the time, which I registered and which I immediately began constructing arguments around. A former teacher, I told myself. She's intellectually curious. She's interested in education. She's looking for conversation rather than anything else. Those arguments were all partially true, which is what made them useful. She was a private English tutor, articulate and well-read, in a way that immediately moved our conversation beyond the surface pleasantries that most of these events produced. She asked what I'd taught, asked what kind of school I'd run, asked with what seemed like genuine curiosity about how a British comprehensive worked, and what the particular challenges of leadership in education were. She was flattering me, of course. I know that now. But a man who has spent 30 years feeling that his professional expertise is respected only within his institution and ignored everywhere else is extremely susceptible to a 25-year-old who finds that expertise fascinating. We met for coffee the following week, then dinner the week after, then a pattern of evenings that I told myself was friendship, and that I knew, somewhere underneath the telling, was more than that, and I knew I was letting it become more than that. And I told myself the knowing was enough caution. Let me say something now about the age gap that most men in my position don't say honestly. It mattered to me. Not in the way it might have mattered to someone insecure about it. I was not trying to pretend it wasn't there. But in the sense that it was the specific ingredient that made the whole thing feel like something I couldn't quite afford to examine too closely. Because if you examine a 37-year age gap honestly, you have to ask certain questions about motivation that the answers to are uncomfortable. And if you don't examine it, you can maintain the comfortable fiction that what you're both experiencing is mutual and equivalent. I chose not to examine it. That choice was where everything else began. By January 2022, we were spending most nights together, and Juan had effectively moved into the Thong Lo apartment. This was not a conscious decision in the way that adults are supposed to make decisions. It was an accumulation of overnight bags and keys left on the counter, and the slow colonization of the bathroom shelf. Ian, who had by this point become my primary social reference point in Bangkok, came for dinner in February. He was warmly polite to Juan and quietly concerning to me afterward, when she'd gone to bed and he and I were on the balcony. He didn't lecture. Ian is not a lecturer, he said, in the way of a careful man choosing his words. She seems very together for her age. I said she was. He said, "What does she want long-term, do you think?" I said, "I thought she wanted what we both wanted. Companionship. Someone to build something with." He said, "Right." And that was all he said. The right had a texture to it that I chose not to pursue. The first financial test came in March 2022. Juan mentioned that her younger brother was struggling to complete his degree because the family had run into difficulties. Her parents ran a small business importing home goods, and the pandemic had hit them badly, left them with debt they were still managing. Her brother needed 80,000 baht, Thai currency, then approximately 1,800 pounds, to pay his tuition fees for the final semester, or he would lose his place. She said she could manage it. If I could help with a short-term loan, she would repay. She said this in a tone so free of pressure that it almost felt like she was asking me not to help. I transferred the 80,000 baht that evening. She thanked me simply, without effusiveness, which I found more touching than gratitude would have been. The loan was never mentioned again and was never repaid, but I never raised it either, because by then we had moved on to larger matters. In May 2022, she raised the question of marriage. Not dramatically. There was no candlelit proposal, no orchestrated moment. We were eating pad see ew, flat noodles with egg and Chinese broccoli, at a place she liked on Soi 49, and she said, as part of a conversation about the future, that she thought about whether we would be more serious and what that would look like. I said I thought about it too. She said that for Thai women, marriage wasn't just a personal thing, it was important to family and social standing, and that a relationship that remained unofficial after a certain point created a kind of pressure from her parents that she found difficult. I said I understood. Looking back, that conversation was architecture. Each element placed carefully to produce the result she needed. I could see the joints in it now. At the time, it felt like honesty. We married in July 2022 at a simple registry ceremony in Bangkok, followed by a small family gathering at her parents' home in the Minburi area on the eastern outskirts. The family were middle class in the specific Bangkok way, a comfortable house, the air of people who had once had more and were carefully maintaining appearances while working toward restoration. Her mother was gracious, and her father was quietly watchful, in a way I noted without interpreting correctly. Her brother, the one whose tuition I'd funded, greeted me with the warmth of someone who understands that gratitude is a useful performance. I liked them. I remember liking them. That's the part I find hardest to square with what came afterward. The legal advice I received before the marriage was precise, and I ignored it. I had engaged a Thai-UK specialist solicitor in London before moving permanently, a practical woman named Bridget, at a firm in Holborn, who had been recommended by a contact at the embassy. Bridget had been explicit in an email that I still have. She recommended that any assets I planned to invest in Thailand be held either in a registered Thai company structure or, in the case of property, in a registered leasehold under my own name, and that marriage under Thai law created community property rights that a foreign spouse might not fully understand they were agreeing to. She recommended a prenuptial agreement that specified the pre-marriage assets as separate property. I had a phone call with her in June 2022, 1 month before the wedding, and I told her I would think about the prenuptial. She said, gently, that I should do more than think about it. I didn't call her back. I told myself it would feel like distrust. I told myself Juan wasn't interested in my money. I had convinced myself of both things so thoroughly that Bridget's caution felt like a slight against someone who didn't deserve it. The condo came in September 2022. We had been looking at properties for about 6 weeks by that point. Juan had first raised the subject in late July, framing it not as a request, but as an observation, that renting long-term in Bangkok was financially inefficient for someone with the capital to buy, and that property in the Sukhumvit area had historically held its value well relative to rental yields. She talked about it with the manner of someone sharing analysis rather than lobbying for an outcome, which was one of her consistent techniques that I only understood as a technique after the fact. At the time, it sounded like a partner thinking sensibly about a shared future. We viewed 6 properties over those 6 weeks, always with Prasert, who was efficient and professional, and who never applied obvious pressure. The property I eventually agreed to buy was a two-bedroom unit in a well-managed development near Phrom Phong BTS station on Sukhumvit, which was a better address than Thong Lo, and which Juan explained with the authority of someone who understood the Bangkok property market better than I did. She cited the BTS access, the quality of the building management, the historical appreciation rate for that postcode. All of it was factually accurate. None of it was the point. The asking price was 8.9 million baht, approximately £213,000, at the September 2022 exchange rate. Under Thai law, foreigners can own condominium units outright if the building's foreign quota allows. This building's quota had been met. The unit went into Juan's name. Juan explained that this was normal for that building, and Prasert confirmed this without particular emphasis. I later established that Prasert knew Juan's family socially. I mention this not to assign responsibility, but because the detail matters when you're trying to understand how a trap closes, how each element is individually unremarkable and collectively decisive. I paid £213,000 for a condominium that was now in my wife's name. I want to stay with that sentence for a moment because I think it needs to be said plainly before the story moves to anything else. I was a retired headmaster who had spent a professional lifetime emphasizing critical thinking and the evaluation of evidence. I paid £213,000 for a condominium in the name of a woman I had known for 12 months. I did this because I had decided that love was sufficient legal protection, and I had decided this because examining the alternative would have required me to confront things I didn't want to confront. The behavioral change after the property transaction was not dramatic. This is another thing that people outside this kind of situation don't understand. The change wasn't a sudden switch from warmth to coldness. It was a gradual adjustment in temperature, the kind that happens so incrementally that your body doesn't register the shift until the room is already much cooler than it was. By October 2022, she was spending 3 or 4 evenings a week at her parents' home in Minburi, which she explained as a family obligation during a difficult period. Her father's business was going through another restructuring. I accepted this. By November, she had begun taking most of her calls in the bedroom with the door closed, which she explained as privacy for tutoring sessions that sometimes touched on sensitive student matters. I accepted this too, in the way you accept a series of individually reasonable explanations, while the aggregate of them forms a picture you're not looking at directly. I want to be honest about the quality of attention I was paying in those months, because dishonesty about it would undermine the point of this whole account. I was paying the kind of attention that a man pays when he has already decided that everything is probably fine and is filtering incoming information through that decision. I noticed things: the calls behind the door, the evenings in Minburi, the slight increased frequency with which she mentioned her father's business difficulties, the new phone she had in November that she said was a replacement for one with a cracked screen. I noticed each of these things individually and filed each one individually, and did not place them next to each other, because placing them next to each other would have required me to look at what they formed in aggregate. In December, her family's business difficulty produced a request. Her father needed 350,000 baht, approximately £8,300, to cover a supplier payment that would otherwise result in a legal dispute that could damage the business irreparably. The request came from Juan rather than from her father directly, which I noted. I transferred the money. In February 2023, there was a further 280,000 baht for a piece of equipment that the business required to fulfill a new contract. She showed me a document in Thai that she said was the contract, which I couldn't read, and which I didn't ask her to translate because asking would have felt like distrust. Then in April, 190,000 baht described as a regulatory fee for a business license renewal. She was apologetic about this one, said she felt guilty asking, that she would find another way if I wasn't comfortable. I said of course I was comfortable. Each amount was individually manageable, and each explanation was individually plausible, and the total, which I was not adding up, because doing so would have required me to look at the pattern rather than each element in isolation, was 820,000 baht, approximately £19,600, over 5 months. A number I sat with later and found almost physically uncomfortable, because adding it up was a thing I could have done at any point and chose not to. I want to tell you about the moment I almost understood what was happening, because it came before the lawyer's call, and I pushed it back down. It was a Tuesday evening in May 2023. I came home to the Phrom Phong condo, our condo as I thought of it, though the title deed said otherwise, and Juan was on the balcony talking on her phone. She didn't hear me come in. She was speaking Thai rapidly in a low voice, and my Thai was not good enough to follow it, but I caught my name. Farang names are distinct in Thai conversation, and I caught the word Nguyen, which means money, and I caught an inflection that sounded like calculation rather than conversation. She turned and saw me, and the call ended quickly, and she said it was her mother asking about household finances. I said okay. I went to make tea. I stood in the kitchen looking at the kettle and thinking, with a clarity that I immediately suppressed, something is not right. And then I took the tea through, and we watched television, and I did not say anything about what I'd heard, because saying it would have required me to be right about what it meant. The letter from the lawyer arrived on the 14th of June 2023. It was from a Thai law firm in Sathorn, addressed to me at the Phrom Phong condo, and I opened it at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning while Juan was out at what she said was a tutoring session. I had been eating toast. The toast was on the plate, untouched by the time I finished reading. I don't know why that detail has stayed with me, but it has. The specific absurdity of a piece of cold toast sitting next to the letter that changed everything, because you had sat down for breakfast and then the world reorganized itself while you were reading. The letter was in Thai, with an English translation attached. I read the English first, all the way through without stopping. Then I read it again from the beginning, more slowly. Then I read the Thai version, carefully, as if the Thai might somehow say something different from what the English had said. It didn't. The letter informed me that my wife had filed for divorce through the Thai court system, under provisions relating to the breakdown of the marital relationship. She was represented by the law firm sending the letter. The letter set out her position with respect to marital assets, which under Thai law includes assets acquired during the marriage. The condo near Phrom Phong BTS station, being in her name and acquired during the marriage using funds contributed by both parties, was described in the letter as her property. The joint account we had opened at a Bangkok bank branch near Asok BTS station in August 2022, which had held 1.4 million baht, approximately £33,000, at its highest point, had been closed. The funds had been withdrawn. The date of closure was April 29th, 2 months before I was reading this letter. 2 months during which she had continued to live with me, continued to have dinner with me on the evenings she was home, and accepted 190,000 baht for her father's license renewal. I sat at the kitchen table for what I think was about 40 minutes. I know roughly how long, because I looked at the clock on the microwave when I first sat down with the letter and looked at it again when I finally stood up. The kitchen had a window that looked onto a small internal courtyard where a cat from the floor below sometimes came to sleep in the sun. The cat was there that morning. I watched it for a while. I'm not entirely sure why I'm mentioning the cat, except that it was the only thing in that courtyard that had nothing to do with any of what was happening, and the mind in crisis seems to locate things with no stake in the disaster and hold on to them. Then I called Ian. He answered on the second ring, and I told him what the letter said, reading out the key sections, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Come over now." I took a taxi to On Nut, and Ian made coffee without asking if I wanted any, and sat across from me at his kitchen table, and I told him the full account of everything that had happened since September 2022, in roughly chronological order, starting with the property viewing and ending with the closed joint account, and the 2 months during which she had remained in the apartment as if nothing was being arranged behind the calendar of ordinary life. Ian listened without interrupting. He has always been a good listener. It was what made him a good teacher, the quality of stillness he brought to things that required patience. When I finished, he was quiet for what felt like a long time. Then he said, "I didn't say enough in February." I said, "You said enough. I didn't listen." He said that was generous of me, and probably true. He didn't say the other things he could have said, which I appreciated. He said the important thing now was to find the right legal representation before doing anything else. And he had a name, a Thai-English bilingual lawyer named Wichai, who had handled a property matter for a friend of his, and who was known in the expat community for being genuinely capable rather than merely plausible. He said to call before going home that evening, and not to have any conversation with Juan about the letter until I'd spoken to the lawyer. I met Wichai the following Monday at his office in the Siloam area, a clean, business-like space that smelled of paper and air conditioning, the furniture functional in the way that signals that the occupant spends money on work rather than appearances. He read the divorce letter carefully and asked me a series of questions that were so precisely targeted at the weaknesses in my position that I knew within 10 minutes that he understood the situation better than I did. He asked whether I had a prenuptial agreement. I said no. He asked whether the condo had been purchased with demonstrably separate premarital funds. I said all of my funds were technically premarital, from the divorce settlement and pension, but that I had no documentation demonstrating this was separate property rather than funds that had become marital upon marriage. He nodded slowly. He asked whether there was documentation of the transfers to her family as loans rather than gifts. I said no. He asked how many times I had spoken to a Thai property or marriage lawyer before these events. I told him about Bridget in London. He asked if I had implemented her recommendations. I said no. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The prenuptial agreement would have protected the premarital assets entirely. The documentation on the family transfers would have established their character as debt rather than gift. The condo could have been structured differently, in ways that would have maintained your equitable interest, even with the title in her name." He said all of this without emphasis, as a list of things that were true and could not now be changed. Then he told me what the likely trajectory of a contested divorce proceeding looked like and what his fee was for representing me in it. I sat with the numbers. Total assets at stake: the condo at £213,000, the joint account at £33,000, the family transfers at £19,600, plus the original brother's tuition at £1,800. Total, £267,400. Plus Wichai's fee for the contested proceeding, plus ongoing living costs outside the apartment during any dispute, plus the cost of extending my visa situation while the proceedings ran their course, against which I had approximately £182,600 remaining of the £450,000 I had arrived with. What was left after 2 years of Bangkok living costs, the condo purchase, the joint account funding, and the family transfers. Which I said, with the same precision he'd applied to everything else, that in my documentation situation, a contested proceeding was more likely to cost me substantially more than the probability-weighted recovery would justify. He advised me to consider the mathematics carefully. I thanked him and paid his consultation fee, and took a taxi back to Ian's apartment, where I was by then staying in the guest room, and I sat at Ian's kitchen table again, and added up the numbers on a piece of paper until I could not find any arrangement of them that led to a good outcome. Ian found me at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning. I had been sitting there since about 11 with a calculator and a piece of paper and the bank statements I'd printed at the pharmacy near On Nut BTS station, going through the numbers for the third time as if repetition might change the arithmetic. He came in wearing a dressing gown and sat down across from me, without asking what I was doing, because it was obvious what I was doing, and he made a pot of tea that I drank without tasting it. I showed him the piece of paper with the numbers on it. He looked at them for a long time. He said, "I'm sorry, mate." I said, "Don't be. You tried." He said he hadn't tried hard enough. I told him that was the wrong lens for it. The question wasn't whether Ian had tried hard enough. The question wasn't whether Bridget at the Holborn solicitors had been clear enough in her email about the prenuptial. The question was whether I had been willing to hear what was being said, and I hadn't, and the reason I hadn't was not ignorance. It was choice. Every piece of information I needed to protect myself was available to me at every stage. Bridget had told me, explicitly and in writing, what I needed to do. Ian had told me, in the careful way of someone who doesn't want to push too hard, that he was concerned. I had the legal knowledge, the financial knowledge, and the personal experience of a previous marriage that had ended to tell me that legal protection and emotional trust were not mutually exclusive, and that assuming they were was not a sign of faith in a person, but a sign of need in myself. The conversation that was missing wasn't the one where anyone warned me more forcefully. It was the one where I was honest with myself about what I was actually doing in Bangkok. Not building a life, not finding companionship, but covering the wound from my first marriage with something that felt like its opposite, and hoping that covering it was the same as healing it. The desperation that drove every decision I made, from the first mention of the property, to the wedding in July, to the condo in September, was not the desperation of a man in love. It was the desperation of a man who needed to believe, at 62, that he was still someone a young and intelligent woman would choose, that the end of his marriage to Patricia had not been a verdict on him as a person, that there was still time to get this right. Juan had read that desperation accurately. She had built a relationship on the precise foundations that desperation requires. And I had stood in its architecture and called it love, because calling it by its right name was not something I was prepared to do. That is the thing I keep returning to. It is the thing that is more painful than the money. And I want to say that clearly because it sounds like a self-serving thing to say. Oh, it's not really about the money. But it's true in a specific way that I need to explain. The money hurts because I'm 64, and it's the money I had left, and starting from this position at this age is genuinely frightening. But what I lie awake thinking about is not the money. It's the conversation with myself that I would not have. The one where I said, "Stephen, you're 62 years old and you've been lonely for 3 years, and a 25-year-old is paying you intelligent attention, and you are using the word love for something that is actually relief." The one where I said, "You know why Bridget is recommending the prenuptial agreement. You know exactly why, and you're refusing to do it, because doing it would mean admitting to yourself what you already know about this situation." I never had that conversation. I had all the surrounding conversations, the rationalization, the self-reassurance, the categorization of Ian's concerns as excessive caution, but not the central one. And the central one, had I been willing to have it, would have cost me nothing except a degree of painful honesty. Instead, I had the conversation with Wichai in the Ceylon office, which cost me his consultation fee and confirmed what the central conversation would have told me for free. I left Bangkok in August 2023. I packed 2 suitcases, which is what you can fit in an Uber to Suvarnabhumi Airport, and that was essentially everything I was taking back. Ian came with me to the airport, and we said goodbye at the departures door, and he said to call when I landed, and I said I would. On the flight I ordered a gin and tonic that I didn't drink, and looked out the window at the Gulf of Thailand until the clouds covered it, and I thought about Patricia, my first wife, and about the conversation at the end of our marriage where we sat across from each other and said the thing we'd both known for 2 years. And I thought about how I'd told myself I'd learned something from that conversation, how I'd told myself the lesson was written into me now, that pain was an efficient teacher. What I understand now is that pain is only an efficient teacher if you're paying attention to the right lesson. What I learned from Patricia was how to recognize a marriage that was failing from the inside. What I should have learned was that the thing driving me toward Bangkok and toward Juan wasn't wisdom. It was the same wound, wearing different clothes. I'm in Peterborough now. I'm renting a room from a woman who has 2 other lodgers and who runs a clean and quiet house where everyone has their own space and no one is required to interact if they don't want to. My pension pays for the rent and leaves me enough for food and the occasional thing I've been meaning to buy for years and kept putting off. The £184,400 I came back with is in a savings account earning modest interest, and I am not touching it unless I need to. Because at 64 with no property and a diminished superannuation position, I need it to represent something, rather than become something I spend in the next phase of whatever I'm doing. James came down from Edinburgh for a weekend in October. He's a practical man, James, always has been, and he didn't say anything about what had happened beyond asking if I was managing, which I said I was. We watched football and cooked a roast on the Sunday, and it was exactly the kind of ordinary family afternoon that I had spent 18 months in Bangkok missing, without quite being able to name what I was missing. Ruth called from New Zealand. She was kinder than the situation warranted, or perhaps she was simply applying the grace that distance provides. She said, "Dad, what do you need?" I said I needed time. She said she'd call every week. She has. Here is what I want to say to anyone who is reading this, because something in it sounds familiar. Not in Thailand specifically. This is not a Thai problem, it is a human problem, and it would have happened to me in Portugal or Cyprus or anywhere else I took my particular mixture of loneliness and wounded pride and new money, and the desperate need to believe that the second time is different because you're older and you've suffered. The second time is not automatically different. The second time is exactly as dangerous as the first time if you are bringing the same unexamined need to it. The wound is not a credential. Having been hurt before does not make you more discerning. In my experience, it makes you less discerning, because you are so determined to prove that you can get this right, that you override every piece of evidence that suggests you might be getting it wrong again. Specifically, about Thailand, about Thai property law, about marriage. Get legal advice before any financial decision, and take that advice seriously. Not as a courtesy, as a requirement. Get the prenuptial agreement that Bridget recommended. Put assets in a structure that protects them. Understand the community property implications of Thai marriage law before you sign a marriage registration. These are not complicated steps. They require paperwork and a small amount of time, and a willingness to acknowledge that protecting yourself is not the same as not trusting your partner. A partner who loves you should understand why you need that documentation. A partner who objects to it is telling you something you should listen to very carefully. I spent 31 years teaching young people to think critically, to ask what the evidence shows rather than what they wish it showed, to interrogate the assumptions underneath an argument before accepting the argument. I taught this so well and for so long that I apparently forgot to apply it to the arguments I was making to myself. That's the dark comedy at the center of this story, and it's mine, and I own it completely, and I am 64 years old in a room in Peterborough, and at this point owning it is all I can do. The second lesson didn't cost less than the first. It cost more. That's not how it was supposed to work.